Hello and good day to you. This is Tracy Harrison from the School of Applied Functional Medicine, and I am delighted that you are joining me today because we're celebrating. Today, we're kicking off a new series of clinical pearls that are inspired by the competency case studies submitted by our newly AFMC certified practitioners. Today, in particular, we're celebrating Rachel and her wonderful work in helping a client, a woman in her early 50s, to successfully reverse a prediabetes dynamic that she had been diagnosed with, and also to get her notably elevated LDL cholesterol back into the optimal zone so that she could, as desired, avoid taking a statin drug medication. A wonderful example to see a complex client through the functional medicine lens, because this woman's challenges weren't just about prediabetes, in particular hyperinsulinemia and elevated LDL cholesterol, but also recurrent brain fog and fatigue, non-restorative sleep. She had been struggling for over a decade with hypertension and was actually taking 3 different drugs for that. She had recurring migraines, was taking a medication for that, had chronic acid reflux, was taking a proton pump inhibitor medication for that, and had been diagnosed with autoimmune thyroiditis. And yes, was taking a medication for that. And a basket of uh, very complex, interconnected case dynamics that can feel really overwhelming to any practitioner starts to make a lot of sense through the functional medicine lens, because we develop the ability through case practice after case practice after case practice to see common patterns of interconnectedness, where we can start with the general presentation of the client, but begin to look upstream and further upstream and further upstream. What are the functional imbalances in the body that are precipitating these symptoms or these diagnoses? And how do we address their root causes so they actually go away, so that medications are not needed to manage them? This case in particular is a fabulous example of how stress, multifactorial stress, can precipitate some pretty complex disease dynamics and diagnoses. This client's husband had been ill for quite some time. She had a highly stressful job that necessitated a lot of travel. And on the in addition to the mental emotional sources of stress, she had been born and raised and living for decades in a community here in the United States that is known for a tremendous amount of residual industrial toxicity. Actually, the small town she grew up in had been declared a Superfund site because it needed so much toxic cleanup. And unfortunately, this woman also had some genetic impairments in her detox pathways, in particular methylation, which was indeed leading to an elevation in homocysteine, which could indeed have been contributing to her hypertension. This woman also had some food sensitivities, which Rachel was able to experiment with her to explore with food eliminations, and determine that gluten and dairy in particular were contributing to her brain fog, her fatigue, and also were major root causes of her chronic acid reflux. A key aspect of stress is that it impairs our digestion. A sympathetic nervous system mode deprioritizes digestion on purpose. It's fairly normal to have maldigestion and some resulting IBS type symptoms when one is very stressed and eating in a stressful state. It also tends to lead to poor eating hygiene, and where we're necessarily setting ourselves up for maldigestion and malabsorption of nutrients. But this chronic acid reflux had led to proton pump inhibitor use. And this medication purposefully breaks digestion by dramatically reducing stomach acid production, which naturally causes nutrient gaps. Most often in minerals, because we don't have enough stomach acid in order to denature the proteins and well separate the minerals from their amino acid chelates. And then vitamin B12, because we need good strong stomach acid in order to prepare vitamin B12 for optimal absorption further down in the intestines. And indeed, this client was no exception. Rachel was able to identify that she had nutrient gaps in magnesium and zinc and vitamin B12 in particular. Well, let's look at the interconnectedness. Insufficient magnesium leads to headaches, leads to constipation, leads to trouble with relaxation, in particular, hypervigilance, anxiety, trouble managing stress, in part because of imbalances in GABA and glutamate and their effects on neurotransmission. And so, no surprise that insufficient magnesium and also the food sensitivities were contributing to her migraines. But then, what was she doing in response to those migraines? She was taking painkillers, nonsteroidal anti inflammatory drugs, which were contributing downstream from that to enhanced intestinal permeability, creating food sensitivities, and also opening up the gateway for chronic autoimmune dynamics. In this case, an autoimmune thyroid dynamic that was creating a hypothyroid state. And when we have a hypothyroid state, we're really quite likely to have elevated LDL cholesterol in the blood because sluggish thyroid, sluggish anything, including sluggish uptake of LDL back into the liver, which simply leaves more of that LDL in the blood available to be measured. But Rachel was able to educate her client about this chain of interconnectedness. And by helping her to adopt good eating hygiene practices, by helping her to identify and adopt sustainable food eliminations of her sensitivities, by helping her to adopt very real and resilient stress management practices, this client's chronic acid reflux went away. So the proton pump inhibitor drugs were no longer necessary. And she did use some short-term supplementation to help address gaps in magnesium, zinc, and vitamin B12. But with removal of the drug and an enriching shift in her day-to-day diet that included a lot of nutrient-dense foods rather than just calorie and chemical-dense foods, this woman's nutrient gaps were able to be sustained primarily through diet. And so when she eliminated her food sensitivities, her acid reflux went away, her energy rebounded, her brain fog went away, and the autoimmune dynamic improved. But when we talk about uh, hypothyroid precipitating disease dynamics in the body. This client was a great example of the fact that hypothyroidism in a given individual often has multiple overlapping dynamics at play because the autoimmune thyroiditis in this case undoubtedly caused in part by all of her toxic exposure and retention and impaired detox over the years. In addition to impaired synthesis of T4 in the thyroid gland itself because of that autoimmune dynamic, lab data showed that this client had poor conversion of T4 to T3 thyroid hormone, which absolutely on its own could precipitate a hypothyroid state. And zinc is a key nutrient in making that conversion. Zinc is key for the synthesis of the enzymes that create that conversion. But on top of that, lab data showed that this client had really marked, clinically high elevations in reverse T3, which is an inactive form of thyroid hormone that the body will often resort to during times of high stress as a way of preserving metabolic function and fuel in uncertain times. And so her reverse T3 was very high, her free T3 was extremely low. And so it makes perfect sense that she was struggling with a hypothyroid state, precipitating a rich diversity of symptoms. And so there are a lot of different pearls to be gleaned from this case, but what I hope you walk away with in particular is an awareness of the multifactorial effects of stress, and that we have to help a unique client to find customized ways to really see and embrace the effects of stress and do something about it. Mindful breathing was a clinical practice for this client to adopt, as well as gratitude journaling and learning to treat mealtime as a sacred time and eating hygiene being a very overt practice of self-care. but also the cascade of dis-ease and imbalance that was being created from the stress to the poor eating hygiene, to the chronic acid reflux, to the proton pump inhibitor drug use, to the impairment in digestion and absorption, and therefore nutrient gaps in magnesium and zinc and vitamin B12, to the chronic migraines and the brain fog and the autoimmune dynamics, right? Zinc being key for immune system regulation, in particular, optimal supply of T regulatory cells. But the headaches and the muscle aches and pains led to use of the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, which contributes to the enhanced intestinal permeability, creating a chronic autoimmune dynamic and food sensitivities, creating hypothyroid function, leading to elevated LDL. This woman didn't ultimately need a statin drug. That wasn't going to address the root cause of anything. What she needed was someone who was savvy in unwinding the chains of interconnectedness at play in her unique life, educating her about it, inspiring her, and giving her practical tools of empowerment so that she could make step by step sustainable lifestyle change to make the disease dynamics go away. And so, in the end, for this woman, migraines gone, brain fog gone, chronic acid reflux gone, constipation and IBS type symptoms gone. She lost 10 pounds. She reversed the brewing of prediabetes by addressing the root causes of her insulin resistance. Her LDL restored to optimal levels. She started sleeping better, and she was able to cut her medications, even at the initial threshold assessment point in their work together, cut her medications in half and still continuing the journey. So, a powerful example of what's possible through the functional medicine lens and what all practitioners can learn to do with capability and also with confidence, using rigorous functional medicine science, but just as importantly, learning about that devil in the detail practical application know-how and getting lots and lots and lots of case practice and therefore confidence in applying our learning. So, congratulations, Rachel, on your wonderful success and breakthrough results with this client. And thank you all so much for joining me to celebrate Rachel, celebrate AFMC certified practitioners, and celebrate the power of the functional medicine lens. Thank you so much for joining me. Have a great day.